that you were able to participate in the Expanding Our Roots interview series. The whole purpose of the interview series is to give you an opportunity to tell your story, talk about the work that you've been doing in the community, and to, in your own way, show that Louisiana is a place of problem solvers, not just a problem to be solved. During the interview, I always ask very deep, multi-layered questions, but I don't start with a deep, multi-layered question. The question I start with is pretty simple, and that is, where are you coming from?
So I am from a small town in Mississippi called Charleston, Mississippi. Charleston, Mississippi does not have any stoplights at all. Morgan Freeman is also from there, but you know, it's just a small rural town in the Mississippi Delta. Country girl, country as mason jars and cowboy hats. I am. So that's where I'm coming from.
So being from Louisiana, I always feel as though there are different layers to the South. The South is not all the same. I grew up in South Louisiana, which is very, French influence, African, Caribbean influence, very Catholic. When I go to other places like North Carolina and Georgia and Alabama, it's very, Baptist, Bible Belt, very English influence. And when I think of Mississippi, I often think of Mississippi as a different layer of the South. I think of Mississippi as the home of the blues. I also think of it as the closest beach, with Gulfport and Biloxi. But I also connect Mississippi with having a very ugly history when it comes to race and when it comes to the experiences of African Americans. How would you describe your upbringing growing up in Mississippi, being someone who, I don't know your age, but may have had to kind of contend with that ugly history being in Mississippi?
Let me say this. I am from the Mississippi Delta, and that is one of the most violent places, anti-Black violent places in the nation, but there's a reason for it. I'm very proud to be from the Mississippi Delta because the Mississippi Delta has an important history. The Mississippi Delta, after World War II, was the biggest seat of Black power and Black voters and Black landowners in the nation. And because we were on the cusp, like the beginning of this civil rights movement as we know it, the federal government, local government, and a lot of the white supremacists got together and said, no, this stuff that we were doing before, we were tying voting to ownership and land ownership, it's too many Black people that own land here. So we got to do one or two things. We got to run them off. We got to kill them off, but we cannot let this much Black power linger in the Delta. So they got together and they did a lot of things. Number one, the USDA actually worked with local farmers to set up farming commissions. And these local commissions were exclusively run and elected by white people. The Klan was very active in keeping Black people from voting. And also this was an opportunity for the USDA to take a lot of the land from Black farmers because they just ran them out. Between the lynching and the killing and all of this other stuff, a lot of Black people were just like, I had enough, and they left. If you go to Chicago, straight up 55, everybody from Chicago got people, every Black person got people from the Mississippi Delta. And in fact, a lot of things we see in Chicago actually came from the Mississippi Delta. But the thing about it is there was a faction of Black people that didn't leave. They were like, we're not scared of being lynched. We're not scared of none of this stuff. We're staying. My father was one of those. We're staying. His family's from Duck Hill, Mississippi. That's not too far from my hometown of Charleston. And so I grew up in a household where both my mom and my dad integrated their respective professions in Mississippi. When they integrated the schools, my dad was one of the first Black high school teachers that went to the white high school. He withstood everything from them putting poison in his coffee to not speaking to him, to white students not doing what he asked them to do. My mom integrated the extension service, which is, connected with the Ag Center. She experienced an inordinate amount of discrimination. My household, my brother and I have a younger brother. we grew up very aware of our Blackness, but also very aware that we were not inferior to anyone. And in fact, our Blackness and the things that our people survived in a lot of ways made us survivors and superior in many ways. So we grew up very aware of race. And so I went to an all-Black high school. I left high school, went to an HBCU, and then that was it. I mean, that was my experience around Blackness. Racism, I never really had, the things we typically associate with racism. I didn't experience those. But as I got out into the world, I did experience a lot of institutional racism and some other isms that at the time I didn't have the words for or the language for. But now I have the language for it. So there's plenty of microaggressions, plenty of snide comments, but I always was like, I'm from the Mississippi Delta, so this is nothing, and we're gonna fight this, and we're not gonna deal with this. And that's a long answer, but that's my experiences.
It's also a very powerful answer because, you can say a lot of things about Mississippi, but you can't talk about the dark history of racism without talking about the fact that so much superpower from the civil rights movement as for African Americans came from Mississippi. I think, just as I think of the lynchings and Emmett Till, I also think of Medgar Evers and Fannie Lou Hamer and all these different heavyweights for, African American civil rights came out of Mississippi. And where there's darkness, there's always light, that in which darkness will yield to. And I also think of that Mississippi as a place where people are hustling for equality and social justice. You talked about, having gone to an HBCU and after high school, but you are now Dr. Grover. So I kind of want to know your journey of going to an HBCU, I assume, to get your bachelor's, and then now having been a doctorate, and to what I know, teaching at HBCU, which is almost like a full circle moment. So walk me through your academic journey and your background.
So I left Charleston, Mississippi, and went to Dillard University in New Orleans. Because when I left my parents' house, I was going to be a stage writer and a filmmaker who was going to change the world through film and doing documentaries, which I still love. My dad was like, you can make films and documentaries, but you need to go and major in something where you can get another job in case this doesn't work out. I said, well, easy. I'm going to be a journalist. And I love my daddy. He's a scientist. He's a natural scientist. He's a chemist and an earth scientist and a physicist. He is quite the genius. So literally, I mean, just because the sun rises and sets on my daddy, which he does for me, but he really, really is. So in his mind, science, like, why wouldn't you go into science? You're so good at science. Well, daddy, I don't like science. So, I mean, not that I don't like it, but I wasn't interested in making a career of it, at least not the hard sciences anyway, because I am a social scientist now. So it's another full circle. But anyway, left my dad's house, went to Dillard, and actually I went to a summer program. I had applied to do the CNN International internship, but my teacher forgot to fill in my letter of recommendation. So I had a public policy backup, which I got accepted into, and this would be 3 years. So I'm like, well, at least my summers are covered. I'll just go. So I went, and it was the most amazing thing. And I got to learn so much and see so much. And so I came back to Dillard that year, sophomore year. And I said, you know what? I'm going to pick up a major of social policy. So I picked up a second major of social policy, graduated from Dillard with a degree in mass communication with a focus in print and in social policy. And then I started looking around a lot of the social issues. And at the time, was like, people from the Delta, Black people from the Delta in particular, experience so much poverty, but yet there's so many different kinds of community. I really want to be in a place where I can study that and make a change in that. So I ended up going to Mississippi State University for my master's. I got a master's in public policy and public administration. During my time there, it was amazing. I got to work it was a very small cohort, and I got to work with one professor who was helping write anti-poverty legislation. So I got to travel and do some things across Mississippi, which I had already done because my mom was an extension home economist. So I would travel with her, you know, some days. And went to Mississippi State, graduated from Mississippi State, got into a program called the Presidential Management Fellowship. It used to be called the Presidential Management Internship, but after Monica Lewinsky, they changed the name because we were like all in DC. And some of us were in the White House. So they were like, y'all fellows now, you're not intern. It's not PMI because she, you know, intern thing. So I did that, and I worked for NASA for a couple years, and I was like, I know it's weird because there are literally, NASA used to get hundreds of thousands of resumes and calls a day for people dying to work for NASA. I was like, I can't work for NASA anymore. I have to get back to poverty. But I want to approach poverty from an interdisciplinary way. So I found a program at Penn State, I found a program at Duke, and I found a program at Clemson. And the program at Clemson just stood out. They just stood out. But I had an offer from Penn State first. And I was like, well, Penn State, you know, I don't know if Clemson is going to offer me a position. So when the lady from Clemson called me, she said, I'm sorry, we're running behind on applications, but you have definitely been accepted into the program. And we want to offer you not only a graduate assistantship for your time here, but also a fellowship, because we really like your background and we see where you could do this. And I thought, wow. So I went to visit Clemson and my mind was made up. I went there and I started my PhD work in policy studies, and it's interdisciplinary. And that is a background of about 5 or 6 different fields: political science, public administration, public policy, sociology, economics, community economics, all those good things. While I was at Clemson, I ran a program for Black youth who were from really poor schools and really poor communities. And Clemson was actually working with those students to get them ready to go to college. They didn't have to go to Clemson, even though they, you know, could, but any college, any place, because the director of Equal Opportunity Office there was a man named Byron Wiley. He's one of the first Black air fighters, pilots in the Air Force. So working with him was such an honor. And I was running this program, and then I was just like, you know what? It's time for me to go. I had worked in the classroom, and I had all these people coming up to me saying, you could really make a big impact in the classroom. You should be in the classroom. And I'm like, but I'm not professorial. You know, I'm not serious enough. I'm going to say what's on my mind. I don't care about a lot of the politics. And if I go, I'm only going to be at an HBCU, a tribal college, or a community college. I'm not going anywhere else. And so I started looking around, and when the opportunity came for me to come back to an HBCU, because my experience at Dillard was amazing. And I'm like, the only way I'll go back to higher education is at another HBCU so I could give the love back that I received. And so when the opportunity came to come to Southern, you know, I applied for it. I went. It was wonderful. And that's how I ended up from Blue Cane Road in Charleston, Mississippi to Southern University.
That is one beautiful journey. I mean, you get to meet all these amazing people, and through every step of the way be very impactful. I think that journey to Baton Rouge is definitely one that I really am just amazed by it. You know, I think that it's great that through every step of the way, you did something impactful, especially even in South Carolina when you're at Clemson, you were able to do something impactful in that community. And that was one of the main things that drove me when I was, getting my education. I didn't want to do something for myself. I always wanted to do something for someone else and to be in service to somebody else. So, I wanted to do international affairs when I was a teenager. I wanted to travel the world, meet people, world peace, all that good stuff. But I graduated early, and my mom was like, I'm not going to let you go until you turn 18. So I was 17 when I started college, wasn't going to turn 18 until the end of my first year of college. So, and I found this really awesome program after lots and lots of journeying and looking at schools, found a program at the University of New Orleans and got my bachelor's in UNO. But I also was in college during the time of, Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Eric Garner. So I was in this, I was in this mindset of, I can save everybody else and, interact with the world and be a diplomat and all this kind of stuff. But there are issues in my own community. I can't separate my Blackness from my Americanness. And I also do want to see the world. I know the world is bigger than America and bigger than Louisiana, of course. And so I found this amazing program at this school called the School of International Training Grad Institute in Vermont, which allowed for me to do a master's in intercultural service, leadership, and management. And I honestly, when I got to New England, I had never gone to an HBCU other than, my mom, she went to Southern. So for homecoming, when I would go to her classes and see her teach, then I was immersed in the HBCU experience, but I had gone to a PWI. But at the same time, I was aware of my Blackness. And I realized that there were certain things that people in the Northeast who are coming from mostly white backgrounds could not relate to. And I also was tired of being away from home. I was in New Orleans. I was in Vermont. I wanted to be back home and do something for my community. And so that led me back home to Baton Rouge. I was able to do an internship, and that internship was with Micah, and that is how I met you. And so I want to know what led you to the Micah Project, which in turn kind of connected me to you as a person and as a professional.
I got involved with the Micah Project when I was actually doing some work at Southern on a report for the Isaiah Project, which is out of Minnesota. And they were dealing with mass incarceration. And so some of the people who were involved in Isaiah Project and in the Micah Project, they had come to campus one day looking for researchers to help do work, because the type of research they really needed somebody who could design research a certain way, and they needed the storytelling element, and they needed it to really make an impact. And so the dean at the time, he called me in. He was like, there's some people I want you to meet, because he had read some previous research that I had done. And that's how I met people from Micah and the Isaiah Project. So when the Alton Sterling case happened and a lot of the, and a lot of the unrest around that came, when a lot of people were planning and talking about things, I was like, well, you have to have an evaluation component, and you also need a component to where you're doing outreach to talk to people. It's not just about organizing, but it's about what and who are you organizing. So I got the opportunity to work with Micah, and that's how I met you when we were working around Alton Sterling.
And I know that the Micah Project, unfortunately, no longer exists, at least as what it was in 2016. But I know that you've been very involved in a lot of different community work here in Baton Rouge, despite the dissolution of the Micah Project. So what are some things that you've been involved in since 2016 in the community?
I did actually start my own nonprofit in 2016 called Assisi House. And we do community-based participatory work around race and public health, because we do believe that race is a matter of public health. And we also do a lot of work with vulnerable communities. So I've been working with that, and I got the opportunity to work with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which was great. Still do work with them. Actually, I'm part of a task force and a development team that's actually helping them develop a curriculum around race and public health. So that's that's wonderful for me because I love that work. I also have been writing for PushBlack, and PushBlack is an online social organizing around information, around Black history, around things that are important to the Black community. Been doing that. I've been raising my son, Ethan. He's 12 years old and he is going to be as big and tall as a door. Which is great. And at the time, my now ex-husband is also huge. So Ethan got that honest. I'm also in the process of putting together, working with other people in the community to put together a center that is sort of an umbrella for services around race, health, togetherness, healing. In the process of trying to put that together because Baton Rouge needs that type of healing so I go to the Unitarian Church and I'm doing a lot of work with the Unitarian Church in the ministry there and in outreach there. But there's one of the ministers there, he says, because Baton Rouge is not yet healed. And I'm like, yeah, Baton Rouge is not yet healed. So I got to work with some people who want to see it healed and put together the center. And I'm also working on a novel. Well, I'm still teaching at Southern. Let me not forget that. Somebody will be like, Grover's not at Southern anymore. Still at Southern, working with graduate students. But one of the things that I've changed a lot about Southern is my teaching at Southern is that all of my classes are now focused on looking at the inherent racism, whiteness, and institutionalization that exists in the field of public administration and a lot of the ways that we do work around social issues. So a lot of my work is around that. And the last thing is I'm finishing up at Columbia University some training. I'm becoming certified in narrative medicine. And narrative medicine is a fusion of the creative arts, science, and social justice. And so I'm loving that work and I'm pushing on through. We're going to offer that, hopefully at our Center for Healing as well.
I want to first ask a question about the Assisi House. I want to know more about the kind of work that the Assisi House does in Baton Rouge, but I also want to know how it feels to start a nonprofit, because I started a nonprofit in 2016 and there have been a lot of highs and there have also been a lot of lows. So what are some, as I would say, triumphs of the Assisi House, as well as what has been some challenges with running the Assisi House?
Well, when I first started Assisi House, I didn't want to because I'm like, I teach people about nonprofits all day and they have gone on to start and run successful nonprofits, or they've gotten jobs in really amazing existing nonprofits. I'm like, so my work there is done. But then as I continue to do more work in the community, I just saw this need for bringing more voices to the table that have never been to the table before, working with a lot of vulnerable communities. So a lot of what Assisi House does is twofold. The first level is something that we call community-based participatory research. I know when people hear the word research, that has a lot of connotations, particularly for vulnerable communities. But when we use the word research at Assisi House, it actually means bringing your voice to the table, thinking about things from those who will be benefit or hurt the most by the policies that are going on. And so we talk with them, we create plans with them, we create evaluations, we create questions and things for them. We even work with them to create stories, to create digital stories, to create these moments where they're stepping into themselves as well. Which brings me to the second part of what Assisi House does, and that is we develop programming around the needs of the community. And it's not the needs that we think the community has, but the needs as expressed by the communities that we serve. The triumphs that we've been able to experience, definitely working with our unhoused women population, working with them to do storytelling projects. That's been a triumph. It's beautiful. We still work with them. We had a conference planned. We were actually going to do a showing of photo voice and poetry, and it was going to be this thing. We're still working on that. We thought about making it electronic and like launching this online thing, but we are trying to find a way to make that more intimate, you know, because it's really worth seeing in person. These are some amazing women. And this has been an amazing project for us and definitely one of our triumphs. And we're going to continue to work with them. Another triumph was the work we do with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is a public health foundation, being part of their leadership program and now being a part of the leadership that's actually working with them around race and inclusion. And that's a triumph. There have been some struggles. One of the goals that I had for Assisi House was to be able for it to be a source of employment and a source of, sustenance for the people in this community. And we're struggling with that. We're still struggling to be able to create positions and have enough income that's going to allow us to be able to do work and hire people. And we've been kind of, we don't have any money. We would love some resources and some money in order to really make this, a part of the community. Because a lot of the things that we do, we just fund ourselves, or we have, donate good donations here and there. And so everything we do goes back into the good of the organization. Another thing that has been sort of a low point for us was during this time, there were grant programs and community partnerships that we had set up. But when COVID came, understandably, a lot of the organizations changed their focus and changed their priorities. And so a lot of the programming that we would normally do, we were unable to do. It hurts when you truly have in mind a vision for your organization and you're unable to do it. I know COVID has affected a lot of organizations, but there's been low points there too. We are still working toward finding a space, and we're still working toward starting a podcast. Those are some things we've been working on, but they've been really hard. And I tell you, for me, starting a nonprofit was, my passion helped me start it. But a lot of times when you are so passionate about something, it can be difficult to keep going. But I'm just like, I'm not ever going to let Assisi House die. If Assisi House just boils down to me asking people to tell me stories on the street with a microphone, that's going to be Assisi House. Like, we're not giving up Assisi House. So it's definitely ups and downs, and working with community members and entities who come and go, and partnerships that last, partnerships that don't last. It's been quite a ride. I'm grateful for it all, but it's been quite a journey.
It's so easy to talk about the successes because we want to always look good, but people need to know the struggles as well. So they know that it's a journey. You're going to fail, you're going to succeed. Sometimes you will fail and succeed almost like a roller coaster. Sometimes you will fail, then you will succeed, win big, then fail. I can say even with A21, it's been a journey because there have been moments where I have been like, oh my God, I have Black, Hispanic, Asian, Middle Eastern, people in the room, Gen X, baby boomers, millennials, Gen Z in the room. I have, people of different nationalities, sexualities, religions in the room. They're all cohabitating and talking to each other and mixing and mingling and sharing their stories and their authenticity with each other. This is my work. I'm doing it. I'm empowered. And then there are moments where I'm like, is this even worth it? And it's okay to have that journey to, sometimes feel good about yourself and then sometimes feel despondent. And I think that being honest about that will help a lot of people who want to start their own thing feel encouraged to know that just because you're failing doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It's just a part of the territory, just keep pushing.
Right. And I think sometimes what we consider a fail, in the end, it doesn't turn out to be a fail. In the end, it turns out to be a sometimes disappointing learning experience. But a learning experience to be grateful. And there have been some things that I really wanted that have just inspired me to think about things a different way. And I'm grateful for those. But yeah, you're 1,000% correctly saying that, because if something doesn't, it's not going to always go to plan. It's not going to always feel good. It's not going to always do what you think it should do. But you have to keep trying. We have to keep doing this work. Everybody can't do this work. You have to be committed to this work, because sometimes with this nonprofit life, I mean, I don't know about you, but there have been times when I have just had to cry about it. Like, and I'm not a crier, but I've had to cry about it and get back up the next day like, okay, let's go.
Yeah, I've had my moments where I was like, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. And then I wake up the next day and I'm like, let's do this. Let's get to it. We just have to, just push forward and think about the people who we're impacting, no matter how big or small that number of people are. Because if one person is impacted by it, that one person will reach 10, those 10 will reach thousands, and your impact will still be felt. What I love about your journey is that you are always making an impact, no matter what you are doing, because you have Assisi House. And of course, there are struggles and triumphs with running a nonprofit and trying to do the work that you do with the Assisi House, but you also teach, and that also impacts people. Tell me about your experiences teaching at Southern and how you kind of teach people to look at public policy and public administration through a more conscious lens, to where they're able to better understand how racism and white supremacy kind of interferes with these systems and disenfranchises people.
Let me just say about my students at Southern that I absolutely love them so much. Some of the most brilliant minds at Southern, some of the students that are there just amazing. All the students that are there that I've come in contact with are amazing. Even the ones who didn't want to do the reading assignments, they ended up doing those reading assignments before it was over, trust me. But teaching at Southern, the best part of it has definitely been the students. Always and forever will be the students. In terms of the way that I teach, I am a big fan of this. It's called the pedagogy of the oppressed, and I'm a big fan of that. I don't treat my students as empty vessels. We are co-creators in the learning experience. And so I treat my students as co-creators in the learning experience. And so when we talk about an awareness of the things that are going on in the different systems, we talk about realizing that all of us in the U.S. public administration system have internalized whiteness and white supremacy. All of us have internalized it, no matter how aware we are. We've internalized it. And that plays out a lot of times in our policies, in the way that we implement policies, and in the way that we evaluate policies and talk about policies. It also, in the way American policy is like, so everything is written down and everything has to be measured and pointed to. And we say we do it in the name of objectivity, but that's actually a form of structural violence, because we know that writing things down and measuring things and doing these things is not always respect the experiences of the people who live in this country, as well as the people whose voices need to be brought to the policy table. So when we think about what does white supremacy, what does whiteness look like in public administration? Well, it looks a lot like what we see going on politically with a lot of the agencies, in terms of people from the top down, for instance, slowing down the Postal Service. Or it looks like, changing the way that we measure things. It looks like handling public health a certain way, with COVID, instead of locking down, it looks like prioritizing profits over people. And unfortunately, sometimes public administration and the institutionalized racism work looks like you and me, just because there are people who feel like their livelihoods and their sense of being is tied a lot to a lot of the things that they administrate. And so what I teach my students is, yes, we understand the theories. Yes, we understand that. But one of the things that's important for me to teach my students is how to develop your own voice. And how do you make an impact regardless of what you feel like your role is, either in the bigger system, in this world, or even just in your everyday work? How can you impact things in a way that's going to be positive for everybody you serve, or however you consider your community? How is it going to be positive? For instance, I was very pleased to be able to work with online a transgender student who really, really wanted to be able to do some work around transgender sexual health and reproductive issues. And this person was seeking a position with something like a Planned Parenthood or a hospital to be able to do this type of work, And I said, okay, so one of the things that we worked on with their paper was, and their work was, how does the awareness of the issues that a lot of transgender people face play out in the system? What does that look like? Is it the pre-interview when you're meeting a new doctor? Is it the ability to have a job that offers insurance? Is it having to go to a free clinic? Like, there's so many layers in the way that these things happen, and we all have different experiences. So once we identify what our voice is, my thing is, come on and develop it. Come on, let's develop it, and not shy away from it, not hide who we are, not hide our voices in the policy process, and to always ask one question. And that question is, who is not in the room that should be in the room? And to realize that when you are a public administrator, that it is your duty to bring these voices into the room, to carry these people into the room. And I always share, hey, I saw something on Instagram that said, walk as though you have 3,000 ancestors behind you. That struck me because we do. However we consider our ancestry, all of us have ancestors behind us. But we also carry people on our shoulders that are those voices, friends, family members that we know about, who will never be represented in the places that we can walk. So when we're in public administration and we're aware of these things and we're deinstitutionalizing and decolonizing the field, we have to bring those voices with us.
What I love about what you just said is that it speaks to the connectedness of us as people, whether we're Black people, Americans, humans, just our connectedness. I often do have to remind myself that I don't live in the world by myself, and that I should walk with a sense of empathy with each and every person I interact with, because each person has value to us. And I would just really admire how you took the time to, help someone else and to, understand their struggles and their identity. Because I'm not transgender, but being able to help somebody who is trans to be empowered to speak up against the system as a cisgender person is empowering. And a lot of people are not going to do that. They're going to say, well, I don't really understand you or your identity. I don't really, agree with it, yada, 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 all that foolishness. And that person loses a voice, and that community also loses an opportunity to be uplifted. You've talked a lot about storytelling, and you've talked a lot about the importance of having people's voices heard. And correct me, but the program that you are studying, that you're getting a certification from Columbia University, is involved in narrative medicine and community storytelling and those kind of things. So tell me more about that program and what inspires you to get a certification in those particular things.
One of the things that I have really learned in dealing with a lot of voices is that our stories matter. And there's a quote from James Baldwin. He talks about why writers write and why art is art. And he's like, if we can change just a little bit of someone's story, we can change a life. If we can tell a story, we can change a life. And it's beautiful because our storytelling and telling each other stories is a basic human function. Before we could write, we told each other stories. And those cultures with a strong oral tradition how we do things is all told by stories. Like I think about the stories about Anansi the spider, and even though people talk about the stories from Uncle Remus being racist, those were the stories my dad grew up on. And those were the stories that were told to him when he was a boy. And he used to tell me the stories before bed. Like it was just, I could not wait for bedtime. I wanted my daddy to tell me a story, and he would tell me a story, and then I would pretend to go to sleep, and then I would read books. But that storytelling is what we do. Every single thing we do, story is it's a part of our entertainment. It's a part of the way we look at things. So story is important. And I got a certification in community storytelling because I wanted to be able to honor stories and harvest stories and contribute stories in a way that honored any community that I was in. Any community that was gracious enough to trust me with their stories, I wanted to be there. And I wanted to be able to honor it in a professional way. So that's where the certification for that came. And one day I was just like, these stories in public health that I'm hearing, I want to, there needs to be more. We need a social justice layer. What are we doing? So I actually, strangely enough, Googled something like storytelling for social justice or whatever. And this workshop from Columbia University pops up, and it's on burnout and social justice. And I'm like, what? Let me go to this thing, because my brother lives in New York. And I'm like, this is an excuse to go and check in on my baby brother too. So I went, and I was just entranced. I did not want to leave. And when they said, oh, we have a certification program too, I said, I have got to get this certification program. I have got to get in this program. And I thought it was just like one of those programs you like, oh, I want to be in it, so I'm be in it. No, you have to go through like this whole application process. And I was like, oh my goodness. But because of some of the comments I had made, they were like, we think that you would really be a good candidate, and we encourage you to apply. So I did, and I got in, and I absolutely love it. We do everything from creative writing to program evaluation to ethics to learning literary forms of listening so that we can better work with people in the community. And I absolutely love it. And it's done through the medical school at Columbia University. So a lot of it is with doctors, and you learn so much from the people that you work with, and so much from doctors, and understanding how stories shape what they do too, which is also why I think Columbia has such a strong equity element. They are aware of the race disparities, and they want to put out doctors who are not only aware of their own internalized biases and racist and white supremacist ways, but those who are aware that how those things express themselves, whether it's through pain medication, diagnosing people, or just maybe even working with the vulnerable population, can really determine whether or not somebody lives or dies. So that's how I got to Columbia.
You also do practice storytelling through literally writing. And I actually had a chance to read one of your articles from PushBlack, and it was an article that you had written about a bridge in Mississippi. I'm not sure if it's near where you're from, but it's a bridge in Mississippi, and it was used to lynch African American people. And you talk about how many of the sites that were used for lynching in the United States have either been destroyed, removed, or redesignated. But this particular bridge is still standing in existence. And I'm not sure, but is it still used?
It's not still used, but because there are things that have grown up over it. It's just this big metal bridge. But so many people were lynched from trees, or they were lynched on certain types of land, or they were beaten and killed on land, or they were burned. So the trees are no longer there. And because a lot of times the trees were actually cut down and passed out as souvenirs to the people who watched the lynchings, along with body parts and burned flesh of the people who were lynched. Those were given out as souvenirs and passed down as family heirlooms. The thing about the bridge is that So many Black people were hung from that bridge. They called it the hanging bridge. And it's still standing. Got kudzu growing up over it now, but it's still there. It's just one of those things that is still, it's something that can't necessarily be torn down. It would be expensive to tear it down. It would be expensive. It is over a river, and it's still there. It's a stark reminder of some of the atrocities that were faced by Black people.
Growing up in the South, I always felt like, because of the history of lynching that I had been, told and I'd read about, I always kind of wondered if some of the places that I have walked through or stood by were the places in which, Black people were lynched. It's like, is like, if I'm driving in the country, driving through forests, is that where, I always wonder. And I think that having a standing, in a sense, standing structure, which may not be used, but still exists, that has that trauma and that history, really does remind, I think, all of us that the history of racism and Jim Crow and lynchings and just violence towards African-American people specifically is something that is not that distant in the past. Some of the things that happened back in 100 years ago, well, it's only been 100 years that, women have been, enshrine the right to vote in the Constitution. There are people who are turning 100 right now, which means that when they were born, their parents, their mother probably couldn't vote. And the ability to vote as a whole, like everybody having at least constitutional access to the right to vote. My grandmother is older than the Voting Rights Act. There are people who were teenagers or my age when the Voting Rights Act was passed, which means that they had to endure not being able to have their right to vote. My great grandfather, it was a while before he was able to vote. He was, very much in his 40s and 50s before he was able to vote. And he grew up in rural country Louisiana, where, that racist history was much more harsher. I heard you talk about racism in personal conversations and on social media through this article, and you talk about how racism is a public health issue. Tell me more about the ways in which racism is a public health issue, but in many ways we don't always think of it as a public health issue.
We don't like to talk about it in this country, but race is a factor. There's a difference between somebody talking about racism and things being racial. We are a very racialized country just because of the way that things have been done in this country for so long. So when we talk about public health being a race issue, the things that have informed how we get access to health have been driven by race. When we think about housing, zip code determines your lifespan. Access to housing determines access to food, it determines access to jobs, to education, all of these factors that tend to play a role in your health outcomes, and they have a symbiotic relationship with health. But also, all of these things that there's a lack of. That's sort of the external forces that drive racism and health. But other of those internal issues, for instance, in the opioid epidemic, which is mostly something that, although it's definitely impacting communities across America, is very much a majority white drug issue. That's not saying that Black people don't have it, but just saying when you look at the numbers, that is 85% of white users. But there are Black people who have needed pain management because of sickle cell anemia. But guess who's most likely to be made to wait in the waiting room because of the opioid policies that have been written? Black people. And the writers of this, including the CDC, have already admitted, hey, you know what? We are adversely impacting those with sickle cell anemia. And we have people that are applying it wrong. But, these are the policies. We didn't think about that until now. So right now, we're actually having increases in sickle cell deaths during the opioid epidemic because Black people are often questioned and assumed to be drug addicts more than their white counterparts, even though the numbers say things differently. It's also an issue simply because of the medical history of Black people in this country. We didn't have agency. So like the whole field of gynecology is built on things that were done to Black women by plantation owners in order to keep more children being born into an enslaved society. Once slavery was outlawed, once purchasing people to enslave was outlawed, then the plantation owner said, well, hey, if we can't buy them, let's breed them. So Black women's reproductive systems became a matter of profit. And so we have we have Black women to thank for the things we know about gynecology simply because that was done. And then you have this notion that for some reason, the early medical science had this foolish notion that Black people somehow can't feel pain as much as other races. So all of the things that we would think about in terms of treatment for Black people, treatment that's normal, Black people sometimes don't get access to, sometimes we're not believed. All of this has culminated, and it boils down to racism. And actually, even when we look at COVID and who's dying from COVID, if you think about the first arguments of why Black people are predominantly dying from COVID was because they're not taking it seriously. They're not wearing a mask. But that's not true. You're also looking at the fact that a lot of Black people have the low wage jobs that have to put them in contact with the public, so they don't get time off. They can't work from home. They have to work in low wage, close contact jobs that expose them to COVID. Or if you look in the cities where there's a lot of public transportation, they have to take public transportation, which exposes them to people who have COVID, or they simply don't have the access or they're not believed. But the first narrative, once again, came out. It's Black people's, it's your fault, Black people, that you are suffering from COVID because you didn't do what you needed to do. No talk of wages being poor, no talk of access to insurance, no talk of poor housing outcomes and lack of access to the things that keep us from developing the diseases that put us at risk. But the fact that, oh, we were too foolish to wear masks. I mean, so you see racialized narratives being pushed at every stage of this.
You talking about that also makes me think about mental health as well. I'm thinking about, for example, the effects of discrimination and prejudice on, adolescent development. And if you grow up in an environment where you're constantly seeing negative images and commentary and perspectives about African American people, then you yourself as a Black person can become depressed and even suicidal because of the fact that, you're so used to these negative emotions and you don't get the support system that you need. And also racial trauma. I was reading something that said that, Black people often are stereotyped for not wanting to swim or not being able to swim. And many have said that that is because of the relationship that we as Black people have to water and to oceans. In Africa, I think in like Senegal, I think in in a West African country, a lot of the buildings that are on the shore do not face the ocean. They face away from the ocean because of that trauma of, the transatlantic slave trade and the people who jumped slave ships to avoid being enslaved, the people who drowned as a result of that. The fact that the water was used to take people away from their homeland and bring them to the Americas. That kind of trauma has been passed down, or even just colorism. There's so many layers to this. And I think that more people need to talk about racism, not in the, oh, you said something mean to me, you're racist, but more so the way in which Black people exist in this world is shaped by prejudice and discrimination and systemic injustice. So we can't escape it, even if we pretend it doesn't exist, because our whole existence is shaped by trying to survive in this world. And I think that is important to recognize.
Absolutely. All of that is part of it. And until we really start having those honest conversations, and until we really start putting actions behind those words, it's going to stay that way.
I want to transition this to a positive note because we do have these issues. We do have racism and manifesting in so many different ways, not just in public health, but in media. Like the list can go on and on and on. But there's work being done, and you're doing that work. But I also know that you want to do more for what you've expressed. You want to do more, and there's structural barriers. There's also the pandemic, which has limited our ability to do a lot. And what are some things that you'd like to accomplish with the work that you're doing, whether it is through your writing or through your teaching or through your work with the Assisi House and your other endeavors?
I would love to be able to open this center that actually deals with healing around race and public health and working together. Another thing that I am looking to accomplish, is to actually write about this. I'm working on a novel, and the novel is based on a lot of the real things that I have written about with PushBlack. And I want to be able to get those stories out, both in nonfiction and in a fiction way for people to be able to learn, and even creative nonfiction. I would love, 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 like this is my wish list. So this Estelle program that we have been working with since 2016 around storytelling and now digital storytelling, I would love to see an annual film festival based on that work where it's actually run by the vulnerable voices that we work with. I would love to see that. That would be such a gift to all of us to be able to hear those voices, and such an honor for this community to hear the stories that I get to hear a lot more often than a lot of people do. It's such a blessing, such an honor. And I know that the rest of the community could really thrive and make some inroads if they got to hear those stories too. So I think we honor ourselves if we had the opportunity to do that. And then it's just, of course, still making Assisi House an employer, like a real employer for people in the community who can do outreach, who can share their stories, who can gather the stories of others, and who can really make some change around race, public health, and certain vulnerable communities. So I'm working on that, and that would be what I would love to see.
I have two final questions. One is more long form, the other one is maybe a little bit shorter. The first question I wanted to ask of the final two is about the certification process. How do you feel the certification, getting the certification and the things that you have in terms of storytelling and all those different things has improved your professional experiences and also your experiences in doing the work that you do?
The certifications have been amazing because they have allowed me to walk in places that I may not have been able to walk as easy. Like having a PhD is great, but I only got my PhD to be able to help people. Like that was it. That was all I needed it for. And when I saw the certification would allow me to walk in different circles than just the PhD. Like this certification from Columbia, for instance, it allows me to walk through medical schools. It allows me to walk medical education in public health with physicians, with doctors, and people on the end of public health that a lot of times can take our vulnerable populations for granted. It also allows me to walk with vulnerable populations because that took a lot of trust and that took a lot of time. And so the communities that trust the work that I do and the work that we do at Assisi House is a big honor. And that's a trust that I never intend to break. And when I'm in these places and spaces where I know that they could, like 9 times out of 10, the members of unhoused women are not going to be sitting in a biomedical complex in Manhattan. But if I'm there, they're there. And I always bring them into the conversation. And I go back to that question, whose voice is not at the table that should be at the table? And I'm aware of their voice, and so I bring it everywhere I go. Another thing that certifications have allowed me to do is to actually just build my confidence in what I know. So my community storytelling certification, as I was going through that process, I was like, I already know how to do this. I already do this. And they gave me the opportunity to say, hey, you're on the path. The work that you're doing, even though you didn't name it, is good. And now you have a name to it. And now you can walk in circles with professionals and make strides on the professional side that bring the community side too. So again, that's another inroads to bring those vulnerable voices. I say, if there's anything that you want to be certified, and of course, I love learning, and but I'm not gonna go back and get another PhD. Grover's done. Grover's done getting degrees, But now watch me end up next time talking to me. I decided to go back to medical school, but no, I'm done with degrees. But I say this: if there's something that you're interested in, the certification really helps open doors on professional sides that maybe would not have been open with just your skill set alone. There's something about a certification and something that just drives professionals mad. They love you with your little certification. You could have been doing the work for 50 years, but with that certification, you can join the professional organizations. You can bring in voices to those organizations that really need our voices. And for me, that's been the big payoff. Or when I want to write about something and it's like, well, oh, you're submitting this book proposal for this. What are your qualifications? It's not, well, I've lived and done this. No, hey, I have a certification in this, or I'm working on this certification and this is allowing me to be able to write about this in a better way. So it's those things that are very valuable for certifications.
I know we've spoken about it a lot, but sometimes, you'll end the interview and you'll be like, man, I should have said this. Man, I should have said that. Is there anything that you wanted to share that you didn't get a chance to share during the course of this interview?
One thing is just that I am so happy for you and proud of you. I want to thank you for doing this work. You inspire me, and from the moment I met you, I've loved the work that you've done. I've loved you. You are definitely a voice of hope and a ray of light in this community. I mean, you just are. It makes me feel safe to see that you're doing this work, because I just know that someone of your caliber, I'm like, if he's here, we good. We got it. We're going to be fine. So I wanted to say that, and I wanted to take a moment to just honor you and thank you for what you do, because it's so amazing. The second thing that I want to say is that we really need to get serious about racism as a public health issue. We are being lynched, and lynching happens. I know when we think about lynching, we think about hanging from trees, but lynching is not just that. Lynching is something that happens outside of the justice system, and it's when a group of people, usually three or more, come together to make decisions that can affect your livelihood without consulting you and without going through due process of involving the right steps. So when we look at some of the decisions that are made, like if you've got sickle cell and you go to a triage, the nurse makes a decision about who gets to be seen first, followed by how you're questioned about whether or not you get access to drugs, followed by the visit with the doctors. And when the Black person with sickle cell gets turned away, that's a lynching. That's a decision made without believing that person, without giving that person the opportunity. Of course, police brutality and all of this, these are forms of lynching, but healthcare is lynching us, and it's doing so in an insidious way. And we have to get serious about it. We have to work to have racism declared a public health issue in this city and in this state. We have to.
I think that seeing the international outcry against, the police brutality incident with George Floyd, and just seeing a lot more conversations about race being had on a corporate level and in more like, for the most part, apolitical branches of government, as well as more apolitical parts of society, are showing that, more people recognize that racism is an issue. It's not a niche kind of thing. It is an issue that everybody should be concerned about. But I also know that there's a lot of work to be done, and we cannot do it alone. We being Black people, we being humans, we can't do it alone. I also wanted to just, say thank you for just those compliments and that affirmation. I really appreciate that. It is very encouraging to hear that other people are inspired by me. I'm inspired back. I'm hoping that more people can have your outlook on things. And I'm also hoping that if they don't have your outlook on things, they'll at least, do some work in trying to expand their understandings of themselves and their community, and no pun intended, expand their roots to the world. I always love hearing you speak, but it's even great to hear you talk about your journey and the work that you're doing in such a thorough way. I enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm excited, and I'm honored, and thank you for everything, because like I said, you're really an inspiration, and thank you. Just
No
wow.
problem. And I'm inspired back. And I will also like to encourage those who are watching to make sure that you look up the Assisi House and show them some love. Community organizations can't exist alone. They are community organizations. So we need to support them. And whether you're living in Louisiana or you're living in another part of the world, find a community organization that you feel is doing work that you're interested in and you think is important, and find a way to support them. Even if it's just sharing a social media post, do something to help them. If you want to, you can talk about it, but you also